Imagine being the forgotten son of the world's most beloved peace icon. Now imagine spending decades carrying a secret so bitter, so raw, that just speaking it aloud could shatter everything the world believed about your family. At 62, Julian Lennon finally said the words that had been burning inside him for over 40 years. "I utterly hated her." But who is he talking about? And what could drive a man to harbor such intense feelings for so long? The answer will shock you, because this isn't just another celebrity drama. This is a story about betrayal, broken promises, and the dark side of being born into rock and roll royalty. What you're about to hear isn't the sanitized version of history that the media loves to tell. This is the real story behind one of music's most famous families, a story that's been buried under layers of public relations, legal settlements, and forced smiles for cameras. Julian Lennon lived in a world where his father preached love and peace to millions, while at home, those same values were nowhere to be found. Today, we're pulling back the curtain on a life that looked golden from the outside, but felt like a prison on the inside. We're diving deep into the confession that took 6 decades to surface, the family secrets that were too painful to speak, and the journey from hatred to something that resembles, if not forgiveness, at least survival. Buckle up, because this story is going to challenge everything you thought you knew about the Lennon legacy. Let's go back to the beginning. Long before the confession, long before the headlines, Julian Lennon wasn't born asking to be famous. He was just a kid who wanted what every kid wants, a normal childhood, a father who came home at night, maybe a game of catch in the backyard. Instead, he got something entirely different. He got a last name that opened doors and closed hearts at the same time. Picture this. You're a young boy walking into school, and everyone knows who you are before you even open your mouth. They don't see you. They see your father. They see the Beatles. They see fame and fortune and assume you're living some kind of magical existence. But here's what they didn't see: the empty chair at the dinner table, the phone that never rang, the father who walked out the door one day and never really came back. John Lennon didn't just leave for a new relationship. He left behind a 6-year-old boy who would spend the rest of his childhood trying to understand what he did wrong. There was no dramatic goodbye scene, no father-son talk about why things were changing. Just one day Dad was there, and the next day he wasn't. And in that silence, a little boy's world crumbled. While the world saw mansions and limousines, Julian's reality was starkly different. His mother, Cynthia, became both parents overnight. She wasn't some wealthy ex-wife living off alimony checks and maintaining a lavish lifestyle. She was a woman forced to sell family heirlooms just to keep the lights on. She worked tirelessly, sacrificed endlessly, and built a protective wall around her son with nothing but sheer determination and love. The fairy tale that everyone imagined, it didn't exist. There were cold flats, second-hand clothes, and the kind of uncertainty that keeps you awake at night, wondering if tomorrow will be better or worse. Cynthia became Julian's entire world, his shield against the cruelty that fame attracts when you're on the wrong side of it. Now here's where the story gets even darker. You'd think having a famous last name would make school easier, right? Wrong. Completely wrong. Julian became a walking target. Other kids looked at him and saw the privilege they resented. They saw a name they recognized from their parents' record collections, and they assumed he had everything handed to him on a silver platter. So they bullied him, they taunted him, they physically attacked him, and the teachers, they did almost nothing to stop it. After all, he was John Lennon's son. Surely he didn't need protection. Surely he was too privileged to be a real victim. The irony is almost too painful to process. The son of a man who sang about peace and love was getting beaten up at school while everyone assumed he was living in paradise. Julian learned a brutal lesson early. Legends are only legends to the people who have to live with them. To everyone else, John Lennon was a hero, a voice of a generation, a symbol of hope. But to Julian, he was just an absent father, a ghost who haunted his life without ever actually being present in it. The foundation of Julian's entire existence wasn't built on fame or fortune. It was built on survival, on learning to endure, on developing a thick skin because the world wasn't going to give him any sympathy just because he carried a famous name. As Julian grew older, the contrast became impossible to ignore. Everywhere he looked, there was his father's face. Posters on bedroom walls, songs on the radio, documentaries celebrating the genius of John Lennon. The man who preached all you need is love to the entire planet apparently had very little left over for his firstborn son. And then there was Sean, Julian's half-brother, born to Yoko Ono, was the recipient of all the paternal affection that Julian had been desperately craving his entire life. The media ate it up. They published photos of John being a devoted, hands-on father to Sean. They wrote glowing articles about his transformation into a family man. But to Julian, every one of those headlines was a knife to the heart. Where was this devoted father when Julian was growing up? Where were the hands-on parenting moments, the bedtime stories, the school plays, the father-son bonding? They didn't exist. And watching his father pour all that love into another child while he got nothing but scraps and silence, it created a wound so deep that decades wouldn't be enough to heal it. There were rumors, whispers that John had called Julian a mistake, an accident. Whether those exact words were spoken or not, the message was received loud and clear. Sean was the wanted child, the one born from love. Julian was the one left behind, the reminder of a past his father wanted to forget. Cynthia tried her best to fill that void, but some holes are too big for even the most devoted mother to fill. The public image of John Lennon as this enlightened, peaceful, loving figure was everywhere Julian looked, a constant reminder that the man the world adored had abandoned the people who needed. As Julian grew older, the contrast became impossible to ignore. Everywhere he looked, there was his father's face. Posters on bedroom walls, songs on the radio, documentaries celebrating the genius of John Lennon. The man who preached all you need is love to the entire planet apparently had very little left over for his firstborn son. And then there was Sean, Julian's half-brother, born to Yoko Ono, was the recipient of all the paternal affection that Julian had been desperately craving his entire life. The media ate it up. They published photos of John being a devoted, hands-on father to Sean. They wrote glowing articles about his transformation into a family man. But to Julian, every one of those headlines was a knife to the heart. Where was this devoted father when Julian was growing up? Where were the hands-on parenting moments, the bedtime stories, the school plays, the father-son bonding? They didn't exist. And watching his father pour all that love into another child while he got nothing but scraps and silence, it created a wound so deep that decades wouldn't be enough to heal it. There were rumors, whispers that John had called Julian a mistake, an accident. Whether those exact words were spoken or not, the message was received loud and clear. Sean was the wanted child, the one born from love. Julian was the one left behind, the reminder of a past his father wanted to forget. Cynthia tried her best to fill that void, but some holes are too big for even the most devoted mother to fill. The public image of John Lennon as this enlightened, peaceful, loving figure was everywhere Julian looked, a constant reminder that the man the world adored had abandoned the people who needed him most. The relationship between Julian and John was a series of false starts and broken promises. After the divorce, contact became sporadic at best. There would be awkward phone calls that felt more like obligations than genuine connections, occasional meetings that were stiff and uncomfortable, filled with long silences and unspoken resentments. John would make gestures, small attempts at connection, a guitar here, a kind word there, and every single time Julian would feel that flicker of hope that maybe, just maybe, this time would be different. Maybe this time his father would actually show up. Maybe this time he'd prove that Julian mattered. But it never lasted. The phone calls would stop, the visits would end, years would pass in silence, and that hope would die again, only to resurrect itself the next time John made even the smallest effort. It was an emotional roller coaster that would have broken most people, this constant cycle of hope and disappointment, connection and abandonment. Eventually, Julian stopped hoping. He built emotional walls so high and so thick that nothing could penetrate them. It was the only way to protect himself from the constant pain of rejection. He convinced himself that he didn't need a father, that he was better off without the disappointment. But deep down, that wounded little boy was still there, still wondering why he wasn't enough. December 8th, 1980, the day that changed everything, for the world and for Julian. News of John Lennon's murder spread across the globe like wildfire. Millions mourned. Radio stations played his music non-stop. Candlelight vigils filled the streets. The world had lost a hero, an icon, a voice that had defined a generation. But Julian's grief was different. It wasn't the public, performative mourning of fans who had loved John Lennon the celebrity. This was the private, crushing grief of a son who had just lost his last chance at reconciliation. Just days before the murder, Julian had spoken to his father on the phone. There had been warmth in John's voice, a softness that suggested maybe, finally, they could build something real. That possibility was stolen in an instant by a stranger with a gun outside the Dakota Building in New York City. There would be no reconciliation now, no heart-to-heart conversations, no chance to hear "I'm sorry" or "I love you" or any of the words Julian had been waiting his entire life to hear. And there was no funeral. Yoko Ono announced that there would be no public service, just a global call for 10 minutes of silence to honor John's message of peace. While that might have been meaningful for the millions of fans, for Julian, it meant he didn't even get to say goodbye. He was left alone with his memories, his regrets, and the deafening silence of everything that would never be said.
If Julian thought the pain ended with his father's death, he was tragically wrong. The reading of John Lennon's will brought a new kind of betrayal, the kind that comes with legal documentation and undeniable proof that you were never really part of the plan. John Lennon left virtually his entire estate to Yoko Ono and Sean. Julian, his firstborn son, was barely mentioned. There was a small trust fund, a token gesture that felt more like an afterthought than an acknowledgement of their relationship. This wasn't just about the money, though that's how the media tried to spin it. This was about being written out of his father's story, about having his worst fear confirmed in black and white legal language. He didn't matter. Yoko controlled everything, the music, the legacy, the narrative. She became the gatekeeper of John Lennon's memory, and Julian was on the outside looking in, just as he had been his entire life. The will didn't just divide assets, it divided family, confirmed hierarchies, and put a legal stamp on the inequality that had defined Julian's existence. So Julian did what he had to do. He fought back. He launched a legal battle that would drag on for years, consuming time, energy, and emotional resources. The headlines painted him as greedy, as a bitter son trying to cash in on his father's death. But those headlines missed the point entirely. This wasn't about getting rich. This was about recognition, about reclaiming a piece of his identity, about refusing to be erased from history. The settlement, when it finally came, was rumored to be substantial, but no amount of money could repair the damage done by years of rejection. No check could fill the void left by a father who never showed up. Now we come to the heart of the confession, the her that Julian admitted to hating, Yoko Ono. For nearly 2 decades, she represented everything that had gone wrong in Julian's life. She was the woman who had broken up his parents' marriage, the woman who had taken his father away, the woman who controlled his father's legacy and kept Julian at arm's length. Every interaction was awkward, filled with forced politeness and barely concealed tension. Public appearances together were exercises in diplomacy, fake smiles for cameras, while underneath, the resentment simmered. Yoko held all the power, and she knew it. Every negotiation, every discussion about the estate, every decision about John's music and memory had to go through her. Julian blamed her for so much of his pain. In his mind, she wasn't a stepmother or even a neutral party.
She was the architect of his suffering, the person who had fundamentally altered the course of his life. The words, "I utterly hated her," carried the weight of decades of anger, frustration, and powerlessness. But here's the thing about hatred. It's exhausting. It consumes you from the inside out. It takes more energy to maintain than it's worth. And eventually, Julian realized that holding on to that hatred wasn't hurting Yoko, it was hurting him. Change didn't happen overnight. There was no dramatic reconciliation scene, no tearful embrace, no moment where everything suddenly made sense. Instead, there were small shifts, tiny movements towards something that resembled peace, even if it would never be love. A photography exhibition became a turning point. Chance encounters forced conversation, and most importantly, there was Sean, the brother Julian had once resented, who became the bridge between two people who had spent so long at war. For Sean's sake, for the sake of not perpetuating the cycle of family destruction, Julian made a choice. He decided to stop fighting. This wasn't forgiveness in the traditional sense. Julian didn't suddenly decide that everything Yoko had done was okay, that the past didn't matter. But he decided that moving forward mattered more than staying stuck in anger. He chose his own sanity over the satisfaction of holding a grudge. The relationship with Sean became the unexpected gift in all of this. Two brothers who grew up in completely different worlds with completely different experiences of the same father found common ground in their shared pain. They bonded over old footage, over music, over memories both good and bad. Sean's kindness, his acceptance, and his genuine desire for connection helped Julian see that family could mean something different than he'd always thought.
The Lennon name was both Julian's birthright and his curse. No matter what he did, where he went, or how hard he tried, people saw his father first and him second. When he pursued music, the comparisons were inevitable and brutal. Critics didn't evaluate his work on its own merits, they measured it against the impossible standard of Beatles-era John Lennon. The pressure was suffocating. The world didn't want Julian Lennon, the artist, they wanted John Lennon 2.0, and when they didn't get it, they were disappointed. So Julian did something radical. He stopped trying to live up to expectations that were never fair to begin with. He reinvented himself. Photography became a passion, a way to create art that had nothing to do with his father's legacy. Writing, personal projects, and humanitarian work, these became the avenues through which he expressed himself and found purpose. He stopped chasing approval from a world that would never be satisfied and started living for himself. The Beatles' nostalgia never went away. Documentaries continued to be made, anniversaries continued to be celebrated, and Julian's connection to that history was never going to disappear. But he learned to carry the Lennon name differently, not as a prison, not as a burden, but as a legacy he could honor in his own way, on his own terms. Julian Lennon's story isn't a Hollywood ending with perfect forgiveness and everyone living happily ever after. It's something more real, more human, and ultimately more powerful than that. It's a story about surviving the impossible weight of expectation, about finding yourself when everyone else thinks they already know who you are, and about making peace with a past that can never be changed. Those three words, "I utterly hated her," represented decades of pain, anger, and loss. They were the honest admission of feelings that polite society says you're not supposed to have, especially not about family. But Julian's willingness to speak that truth, to own those feelings instead of pretending they didn't exist, that's where the real healing began. He found a fragile peace, not through denying the hurt or pretending everything was fine, but through accepting that some wounds never fully heal. They just become part of who you are, scars that tell the story of where you've been and how you survived. His relationship with Yoko may never be warm, but it doesn't have to be poisonous either. His father is gone, and with him any chance of the reconciliation Julian deserved. But Julian found family in unexpected places, with Sean, with the life he built on his own terms. The hidden cost of fame,
the myth of perfect families, the strength it takes to step out of a giant's shadow. Julian's journey exposes all of it. He showed us that you can be the son of a legend and still struggle, still hurt, still feel forgotten. He proved that being born into royalty, even rock and roll royalty, doesn't protect you from pain. But most importantly, he demonstrated that healing doesn't require forgiveness. Sometimes it just requires the courage to stop fighting battles that can't be won and to start building a life that's authentically yours. If Julian Lennon's story resonated with you, if you've ever felt like you're living in someone else's shadow or struggling to forgive the unforgivable, you're not alone. His journey reminds us that we all have the power to rewrite our own narratives, to step out from behind the expectations others have placed on us, and to find peace even when perfect closure isn't possible. Hit that like button if this story opened your eyes to a side of the Lennon legacy you never knew existed. Subscribe and turn on notifications because we're bringing you more untold stories from the lives of music's biggest legends, the real stories behind the headlines, the human truth beneath the fame. Drop a comment below and tell us, do you think Julian was right to speak his truth, or are some family secrets better left unspoken? Thanks for watching, and remember, every legend has a shadow, and in that shadow, there's always a story worth telling.